As the coronavirus pandemic sweeps the nation, many have been looking for any sort of historical precedent to understand this moment. And naturally, Sagar, many have looked to the 1918 outbreak of Spanish flu.
That's right. So joining us now is Skip Desjardin. He's the author of September 1918, War, Plague, and the World Series. He's head of sports at YouTube TV. Skip, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Skip, tell us a little bit about the book. I mean, obviously, in the intersecting, we've seen a basic shutdown of American life across the country. Americans are stuck at home. There's no sports to watch. I mean, just talk a little bit about the book and then the eerie parallel of 102 years later experiencing all of this yourself.
Yeah, it really is amazing, the similarities between what happened 100 years ago. And my book centers on the city of Boston and what happened in that 30-day period in September 1918. But it is a good lesson for what we're going through today, in that a couple of things happened then that we've gone through here in the last couple of weeks that are fortunately just now starting to change. Spanish flu started obviously overseas, but mutated on its way back here to the United States and became a much more lethal disease. And it broke out in Boston during that month. And the exact curve that we're all trying to flatten these days took place in Boston that month, where you had this very sharp rise in the number of infected people, and then a dramatic drop-off by the end of the month. At its peak, there were 85,000 people sick with Spanish flu in just 1 week in Boston in that month. Now, we've got a total of 5,000 people in the entire country as of today. So can you imagine, with 85,000 people just in one city? And when it was at its worst, one person in Boston was dying every 9 minutes. And so, this is a pandemic on a scale that we have not yet experienced. And we're collectively all doing everything we can to try to keep it from being that bad. But it gives you a bit of a scary look at what can happen if a pandemic really gets out of control.
And Skip, what were the implications for society at that point? I mean, how were regular people sort of responding and reacting to this death occurring just all around them?
Well, one of the reasons that it had the very sharp bell curve was that people didn't know for quite some time. During World War I, under the Alien and Sedition Acts, it was actually illegal in America to criticize the government or to print anything in a newspaper that could be considered bad for morale. And at the end of the day, what could be worse for morale than giant headlines that said, thousands of your neighbors are dying? So newspapers did not talk about it for weeks. One of the things that caught my attention early on and caused me to write the book was I had this question as to why in the world people would go to the World Series at Fenway Park in the middle of this epidemic, when going out and being in a crowd could literally kill you. And what I ended up finding out was it was because they didn't know. No one was telling them. And until it actually came home and someone in your family or next door became sick, there was no way really for communications and media to tell you what was going on outside your own neighborhood. And so the government had a vested interest in not having you know, unfortunately. They were concerned that people wouldn't buy war bonds to fund the war. They were worried that people wouldn't go to their job at the factory to build ships or manufacture guns or turn out boots and blankets for the soldiers. And so the government was trying to keep this under wraps as long as they could because there was such political pressure for life to go on as normal.
And Skip, one of the interesting things is this time around, everybody does know. I would say everybody in America does know at this point. And yet people are still going out, congregating. I mean, it effectively took localities having to shut down nightlife in order to stop some of that congregation. What do you owe that to? Whenever people in 1918 found out what was happening, did they start going out? I mean, was there a same kind of cavalier attitude? Did the government have to step in? What are some of the parallels that we see today?
Yeah, the Spanish flu so overwhelmed society in Boston that you couldn't ignore it anymore. The hospitals closed. They just locked doors and wouldn't let anybody else in because they were totally overloaded. And then doctors began to die and nurses began to die. And eventually the city was using Girl Scouts as nurses because they'd run out of anybody else.
Whoa.
So in that environment, and partially when you're too sick to get out of your house, as opposed to having a choice to go or not go, the city went through very much what we are going through now, but they were forced into it as opposed to doing it voluntarily.
And what sort of learnings can we take from that moment? I mean, obviously, it's a very different point in history. The way information spreads is different. Understanding of sort of infectious disease is potentially different. But are there lessons that we can take from that era?
Yeah, there's a couple that strike me. One is that math is scarier than science. And the second is that you can never be too prepared. You know, the foremost infectious disease specialist in all of America was stationed at a naval hospital in Boston Harbor, and he saw the very first Spanish flu patient, and he knew exactly what it was, and he took all the correct steps that are so familiar to us now. He quarantined that person. He treated that person. He found out everyone that person had been in contact with and tried to quarantine them. But by the time the sailor showed symptoms and showed up in the hospital, he'd already infected too many people, and the virus had escaped. So best intentions, best preparation, exactly the right doctor in the right place at the right time, and still math couldn't be stopped. So that's one of the things that we have to keep in mind today, is that it's a minor inconvenience to sort of go and find no bread on the grocery store shelves. But we're at the very earliest stages of this process still. And things could and probably will get much worse. Our goal is to make sure that it doesn't get as bad as it did then. And it is becoming a cliche, this whole idea of flattening the curve. But you'd rather have a shortage of toilet paper than a shortage of ICU units.
I think that's the most important thing that we can underscore. All right, Skip, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on. I wish it wasn't under these circumstances.
Certainly. Same. We'll have you back in happier times. Thank you. We'll have more Rising for you right after this.